Okay, so to get started, I'm going to add a plane. Now, of course, this is just a normal plane that's 2 meters by 2 meters, so we can scale it up to be the size of the forest. I'm going to scale it up to 2000 so that we have a nice big forest here. I'm also just going to apply the scale and change my view here. All right, this is just a flat plane, so we can add displacement. And let's add 2 cloud textures because obviously there's no texture right now. So let's head over to the texture editor here, change this to clouds, and just increase the strength. And you can see it's not actually doing anything, so we need to subdivide so that it can actually use geometry to displace it, and shade smooth as well. Maybe I can increase the strength a little more. So right now there's actually a lot of tiling going on. And what we can do to fix that is adjust the noise size. So head over to the texture editor. For these larger waves, I'm going to go with 400. And now we don't see as much of that tiling. From here we can increase the strength even more, maybe to something like 240, 250, maybe even more than that. So these are the larger waves, but we can also add some smaller waves, right? Because it, at a smaller scale, feels a little bit boring, right? Since it's a very smooth curve. So to do that, we can add another displacement and add a new texture. I'm going to go ahead and name these large waves, small waves. All right, so now we can adjust the large waves texture and we can adjust the small waves texture. Switch this to small waves. And for the smaller waves, I'm going to use a scale of 30. If we go back to the modifiers, it does this weird thing where like it switches the texture that each displacement is using, so you kind of have to switch this back. Increase the strength on this other one. Yeah, so it's looking much more interesting now, but we could use a little bit more definition. So let's add another subdivision and just put it up here. Okay, that looks good. Maybe 80 strength is way too high. Let's go with maybe around there. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. Maybe I'll go with an even smaller scale than that, if I can click the right thing. Maybe let's try 12. Switch this back again. Okay. And you can, of course, increase this. Now to get a material on here, let's just go to shading, my view settings here as well. So we want to add a material on here. However, after we do that, you'll find that material needs to be tiled a bit more. So we can increase that, not to 400, 40, no, 40 is too high. Maybe 13, something like 13, maybe 8. And we can also apply the scale and Smart UV project. So I think that looks pretty good, but right now the material is on like the whole forest, right? What happens oftentimes is that hills and things will have like a rock material because there's like cliff there, right? So in order to create that, we can duplicate the principled BSDF. Just click on it, Shift-T, drag, add a material to this. Same thing with the Control-Shift-T. So we now need a way to blend these two materials, right? Let me drag that for clarity. And we can start with a mix shader. Mix shader right there. And just go ahead and plug this into the second input. So right now, this will actually not do what we want it to, because this is like a blend across the entire thing. This is like representing how much of the second input we want to show. So like 0 is like all the first input that is coming out of here, but 1 is all the second input that's coming out of here. 0.4 will be 40% the second input and 60% the first input. So first of all, let's tile this to 8. Actually, so this is not what we want. So how can we access the slope of the mesh? There's a few ways of doing this. The way that I like is to get a geometry and then take this normal and then separate XYZ. And then plug the Z value into that factor. Now this is close. You can see that, like, if we visualize this, this is actually like, it's kind of actually hard to see. The hills are darker than the flatter parts, actually. So if we get a color amp, then plug that in there, maybe visualize that, and then I bring these in, maybe around there. Now we're getting the hills to be much darker than the flatter areas. So let's visualize this mix shader again. And now this is pretty close to doing what we want. The fire is pretty straightforward. So if I bring in a cube and, scale it to around the size that we want our fire to be, we can add a fluid modifier and then go to the physics settings, set this as the domain, because this will be like the boundaries of our fire. Okay. Now for the domain type, we can just leave it at gas, and the resolution division, I used 128 for mine, but 64 is good for previewing, maybe 32 depending on your CPU. Now, if we play this, nothing happens because we don't have an emitter. So if we now add some more cubes, and you want to make sure that these cubes are inside the domain, and just scale that up around there. And let's add a fluid modifier to this as well. And then this will be flow. Set this to fire, and then set this to inflow. And now something will actually happen when we hit play. It's kind of weird right now. It's not really doing much. So we can set the initial velocity to about 25 on the Z. And let's see if that looks any good. That looks okay. But it's a little bit too much smoke for my tastes. This is a pretty easy fix. We can just scroll down to, in the domain settings, scroll down to fire, turn this flame smoke down to 0, and let's add some dissolve and noise while we're at it. A value of 3 for the time is pretty good. So yeah, in my render, I just had fire, but if you want to have smoke, you can have some. And in the inflow object, just make sure to set this to fire plus smoke. Now we can duplicate this. And if we play it again, you can see that all 3 objects are now emitting fire. Now for the material on this, we can just click the domain and go to shading, new, and then replace this principled BSDF with a principled volume. And just plug that into the volume. And then for the color attribute, we can type in temperature. There we go. Now in the render, you don't actually need these inflow objects to be visible, so you can just turn these off. As you can see, turning them off kind of doesn't do much in this case, but depending on how the fire is turning out, it might make a difference. So when you have everything looking the way you want it, you can go ahead and scroll down in the domain settings to this cache section and change the type to all, and then just bake all after selecting the folder that you want to have the simulation on. To make this plane look like it's been hit from the top by another plane, I'm going to go ahead and add 2 shape keys. And on this key 1 here, I'm just going to go into edit mode and select these faces. And let's turn on proportional editing so that that doesn't happen. So just rotate that on the x-axis like so. And same thing on the other side. There we go. So now as we increase this value, you can see that the shape key activates. And of course we can animate this using this button here, or we can hover over this and hit I. I'm going to go to about frame 22 or so. Just set this to 1, press I, and we can move multiple keyframes, and that will change where the event occurs. That jet's gonna hit right around frame 40. Here we go.